Welcome. My name is Nick, and I get to serve as the Community Engagement Director here at Cambia Grove. By a show of hands, I see a lot of new faces. Who here is here for the first time? This is so wonderful. Welcome in, everyone. Welcome. I see a lot of familiar faces as well. Thank you for coming back and supporting this work and joining us in these conversations. For you folks that are newer to the room, Cambia Grove is a health innovation hub, headquartered here in Seattle, Washington. We do have a national presence. We have a colleague that we brought on board last year to kick off our efforts in Utah. So we're figuring out how does our approach scale into other areas. It's worked so well here that we have the opportunity to grow this model and build health innovation ecosystems to bridge gaps in health innovation. Our whole mission is to see that innovation flows more freely in healthcare. We all know there's a lot of opportunity in that space. There's a lot of responsibility to do more, and we're so grateful to have a community like you all to help connect those innovations to real problems. So just by a quick plug, next week, I know a lot of you will be there. We have a big conference. It's our 5 Points of Healthcare conference. It is what we do. This is our 3rd annual gathering, and what we do is gather expertise. They'll be here on this stage talking about the bright spots in innovation. So the 5 points, real quick: patients, payers, providers, policymakers, and purchasers, so employers that buy healthcare for their employees. We really see those 5 key points to be the focal points around the healthcare system. So we'll be talking a lot about how it was intended to work, such as there was intention, and how does it actually work. And the gap between the two is where innovation is most needed. So if you can join us for that, there's still a few tickets left. It's a day-and-a-half conference. It's a good deep dive into the bright spots where innovation is most needed. Today, we get to kick off our 2020 Lunch and Learn series. This series has been a great partnership with Echo Health Ventures. You'll hear more from Anahita here in a moment. But this is our opportunity to dive a little deeper. This is what we consider to be more the business development type offerings that the Cambia Grove gets to offer. So we'll, throughout the year, dive into pretty specific, discrete subject matter and bring experts to the stage to really share where they see the bright spots to be and offer some great guidance to you all. And so the format for this is relatively simple. Anahita and will share their thoughts and observations on market trends pretty globally, but we'll have ample opportunity to hear from you in the audience at the end. So we'll be passing mics. We are recording this opportunity for others that aren't able to join us, so please ask your question into the mic. So with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Will and Anahita to the stage to kick off this series. Thank you, Will and Anahita.
Oh, we have our own. Okay, great. Nice to meet you again, yeah.
Nice to meet you as well. I'm starting, correct?
Oh, I'm sorry. So, Anahita,
okay.
if you want to kick us off with an introduction of Echo Health Ventures?
Perfect. Great. Hi, everyone. My name's Anahita Nakshri. I'm an investment associate with Echo Health Ventures. How many of you in the room are familiar with Echo? Oh, good. Okay, quite a few of you, so I'll keep this brief. Echo Health Ventures we just celebrated our 3-year birthday, was established as a joint venture between Mosaic Ventures, which was the investment arm of Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina, and Cambia Health Ventures. So both North Carolina and Cambia Health Ventures are our 2 LPs. Cambia Health Solutions represents the Blue Cross Blue Shield plans of Washington, Utah, Idaho, and Oregon. And we very much embrace the corporate strategic investing model, where we are focused on identifying hotspots within the digital health ecosystem that helps to advance our parent company's long-term strategy. And while strategic insights and returns are very important, more and more you're seeing strategic funds focused on financial returns and operating similar as some of the institutional funds. So we co-invest with many other corporate venture funds as well as institutional funds. We are about a $400 million fund, and this is a quick take on our portfolio. So we've been very active over the last few years. We've been fortunate in that time to have a couple of exits. Both Livongo and Phreesia IPO'd within the last year. And some of the investments on the side are our most recent: Quartet, Genome Medical, City Block. We'll go into what we look for in the market, but overall, very interested in identifying opportunities that help to guide and steer payer strategy. But really, we're investing across the board in tech-enabled health and services. I think for us, what remains out of scope is traditional biotech investors. I think that's why Will and I have a good balance here between digital health and life sciences investing experience. But it's an active market, and we'll discuss. But we're excited about the activity over the last few years. And this is just a quick example. When we, as a strategic partner, when we make investments, we do what we can to help create commercial opportunities between our portfolio companies and our parent companies and our parents. And so this is an example of one of many case studies where we had made an investment in Livongo, and Livongo is now closely working with Cambia. And so we have a unique model where we have the investment side and then a dedicated market development, what we call ECHO Health Advisors team, that's focused on identifying how companies can work with our parents. And I'll hand it off to Will.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so we have a bit of a complementary approach, and so WRF is actually a nonprofit, so it stands for the Washington Research Foundation. We have a brand under which we do investing called WRF Capital, and so I'll go into a little bit more about that, and then my background, and then we'll kind of, I've picked a few market trends just from my experience and talking to my colleague, Loretta Little, who does more of the digital health investing, I'm more of the biotech side, but we'll get more into that in a bit. So WRF, we're based here in Washington State. We're independent. We're not attached to the University of Washington, the state government. And we do two things. We do grants to nonprofit research institutes here in Washington State. So that equates to about $10 to $11 million in gift funding each year. And the objective for that is to move technologies out of Washington State research institutions like UW, the Hutch, WSU, to commercialization. Those are all no strings attached. We're not getting IP clause into it. We just want to have more technologies get out. We also have WRF Capital, which is doing early stage venture investing with a preference for things that have IP licensed out from those same institutions. So the goal, if we're successful, is to push more technologies out with the gifts, make good investments for return, but that return goes back in the pool of capital to get more gifts out. There are some of our partners over there, and you can see some of the high-level results. On the investing side, we've invested in about 99 companies in our history, so a long history here in Washington and looking for opportunities all the time. On the personal side, so this is a bit of my background. So I got my PhD here in health economics and outcomes research at the University of Washington School of Pharmacy. While I was doing that, I did consulting for a number of different biotechnology and pharmaceutical companies. Those are in the middle there. And prior to coming to Seattle, I worked in two startups in the Boston area. They're both acquired. One was the next generation sequencing, when that was still a new thing 10 years ago. And the other was what we called a genomic benefit manager, so trying to do what PBMs did for drugs, but for diagnostics. And that was acquired by CVS Caremark. So I was doing health economics without realizing it, and then wanted to get more training. That brought me here to UW. So this is a bit about my portfolio. So it was a great introduction about ECHO Health and the things they do. My portfolio is complementary. So less in the digital health space. I have some therapies here. All of these have some sort of IP connection to Washington State institutions, life science tools, so genomics, bioinformatics, and then also I invest in everything that we look at outside of healthcare. So if it's a robot or a software for a robot, I also do some of that. Okay. So now I've picked things randomly from viewing the internet. I'd love to have your opinion on it too, as someone who's more digitally health focused. But before we go into any of that, I was hoping to get sort of more of a sense of who's in the room. So how many of you are actually working in a young company? Okay. How many of you are more in a larger, more established company? Okay. Are there anyone for payers here? A payer perspective? Health systems? Providers? Anyone else? Or? And who else? What else did I miss?
Pharma.
Okay, so that's helpful. Okay. So there are 10,000 different graphs I could show you to describe how the U.S. healthcare system is facing challenges about sort of rate of increase of spending and lack of quality outcomes. So this is one of my favorites, just shows the percent of total healthcare expenditures as a percent of GDP. So of all dollars exchanged in the US, how many of those are for healthcare? Getting close to 1 in 5, which is pretty high. But then interestingly, if you tease that apart, who's actually bearing the burden of that increase? So the graph on the right breaks it out by private health insurance and then public health insurance like Medicare and Medicaid. And you can see that increase is being predominantly borne by private health insurers like Cambia Groves or Blue Cross Blue Shield. So interesting to know like who has the incentive to actually fix the healthcare system. There's a lot of policy changes that need to be made, but it may also just be the private sector. And so I think that's a good opportunity we have here. And then this is from that same Kaiser report. And so what are firms, companies doing, self-insured employers doing to help bend the cost curve? And so we'll talk about some of these. Coverage at retail clinics, on-site clinics, telemedicine. So people are trying a lot of different things. They're becoming more established as they're going through time. Okay. So another quick poll of the audience. For those of you that raised your hands for working in a small company, how many of you, so if you think about your primary customer, you're having to serve a lot of different people, but how many of you view the patient as your primary customer? As the clinician? That's great, yeah. Payers? Okay. Providers? And then health systems. Great. Yeah, healthcare is really unique in the fact that any other market, if you got to buy a TV, the person deciding to use it, the person consuming it, and the person paying for it are all that same function. It's teased apart in healthcare, which provides a lot of interesting market dynamics. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, since we're actually getting to the market trends I pulled out. But one thing that I've noticed at conferences and across the board, and when I'm hearing company pitches, we had an event here maybe like a month or two ago for Health Innovation Northwest, and Brad Youngren from 98.6 was presenting, and he described that when they're launching their telehealth solutions, they view the provider as one of their customers. And so it's a dual customer model, both patients who are receiving the care, but also if providers don't see that as valuable, if they're not actually providing a service to providers, then they're failing. And so this is a bit borrowed from that because it really got me thinking. I've never heard it described so clearly, but I have heard a trend about physician burnout. And so I try to look at the data around it, and it's pretty overwhelming, right? So physicians, this is nothing new, but they are experiencing large rates of burnout. This is a study from Annals of Internal Medicine last year about the actual cost of that to the healthcare system. So if you include turnover and costs of reduced work hours, about $5 billion annually from just the pressures we place on our providers. And I'll turn it over to you and see if you have
Yeah,
other
I
thoughts
think
on that.
in terms of how this relates to startups, I mean, if you look at the data, about 80% of the startups coming to market now are selling into enterprise meaning providers and payers. But I think what's interesting is that as you're building the technology, I think some startups don't will think that the technology on its own can exist, but don't realize that it needs to be combined with functional business models in order to deliver real value. And so a lot of the time, it's not created to relieve provider workflow, but may add to the cumbersome nature of the workflow, or to the cumbersome nature of the IT resources needed to build the infrastructure and integrate the infrastructure to the health system or payer infrastructure. So I think it's very important to remember that if you are selling into the enterprise, you're not focused on the consumer, but you're focused on payer provider. How are you building the technology to help relieve their workflow, not add more burden to their workflow?
So when you're seeing a pitch from a company, how can you tell that they've done that process, they've actually thought about that, or what's sort of a key signal for you as an investor that they've done that?
I think what's interesting is a lot of companies will focus on, well, the data that I'm providing is really valuable, but they're not necessarily thinking about how it becomes usable, right? And so, the company may be focusing on remote patient monitoring and tell a health system or provider, we're going to provide you alerts on your diabetic population, and you'll be able to monitor them and that'll be part of your workflow, but they don't realize that the user interface is incredibly important. So are these alerts integrated into workflow already? Is this a separate interface they need to log into? How resource intensive is the infrastructure build? And so those are just some of the examples. It's not just the value of the insights, but how can those insights actually be realized in a seamless manner?
And I had some just examples of companies here that I think are doing something similar, viewing the physician or the provider as one of the key customers. So 98.6, Saycara, and MD Metrics, all local companies. All right, so this is a two-part poll. How many of you have actually used a telehealth service for yourself, either as a provider or as a patient? Okay, so about a third. How many of you have a telehealth service available to you? Maybe haven't used it. Okay. About 2/3. So it seems like there's growing adoption of it, so more availability of it. Everyone's starting to see some applications of it. Not everyone has actually used it, but then also I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about how it's actually expanded from particular applications to broader, or if it's suites of services, or how people are thinking about how it starts to go more into the mainstream.
And would welcome audience commentary as well. But I think when telehealth first came to the market, it was mostly designed as a direct-to-consumer model, and I think and very much a first-generation direct-to-consumer model. And slowly you've seen that evolve, where these telehealth companies, the Teladocs of the world, American Well, MD Live, they are selling into enterprise because payers and providers are trying to build their digital front door. And what I mean by that is adopting a consumer-centric approach to meet demands around convenient care delivery. And so there's been an evolution in the business model. And I think that the jury is still out on a lot of areas of digital health technologies, but I do think that telehealth has been one that is beginning to become part of the healthcare lexicon. And so I think, most would say telehealth is here to stay. Of course, there's a lot of work to be done. But these companies have found that partnering with enterprises, and meaning payers and providers, is a more effective model than direct to consumer. And it's becoming an integral part of these enterprises' digital front door strategies.
Next poll. Okay, so this is a two-part, so we'll raise our hand for either. So healthcare services will be more or less targeted directly to the patient. So how many of you think healthcare services in the next year will be more targeted to the patient? Okay. Less targeted? Okay. I would tend to agree with most of the people in the room. So yeah, I think that one thing that I'm seeing as an outsider looking in, more consumer-facing healthcare, the challenge I've always seen when I've seen business plans in this space is just revenue models, the consumer actually paying. Obviously, if you're working with a payer, that's access to more resources, but there's other challenges there. It's easier to make a direct sale. But I think that from what I've seen, at least in the evolution in the past 2 or 3 years, that's starting to be refined in some specific areas where you can actually think about sustainable growth models and revenue, really starting to get to that. And also just viewing the patient not only as the consumer, but also another partner in access to data or resources as well. So I kind of lumped in monitoring in here as well, or something I'm familiar with in the health economics outcomes world, patient-reported outcomes. So how are patients doing? Just asking them, getting that resource from them, so including that in a structured way. Yeah, but I'd like to see how you, or if this rings true to your experience.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting because I think, over the last year or so, we're starting to see kind of a second generation direct to consumer business models. And what I mean by that is some of these companies, particularly in the pharmacy space, they're thinking about how do we digitize the supply chain, as I like to say, so that it is certain care delivery models are becoming much more consumer grade. If you think about consumers' experience in other industries outside of healthcare, they expect convenience, they expect cost transparency, they expect fast delivery. And so I think the companies in healthcare that are doing this well is in pharmacy. So you're seeing digital pharmacy models that have done a good job in bypassing some traditional stakeholders, whether it be retail pharmacy or providers, and providing consumer grade experience. So whether it's creating, a targeted e-commerce marketplace where there are certain therapeutic product sets where a patient can go to the site and order certain prescriptions around, even HIV or birth control or hair loss, even erectile dysfunction. These are becoming really popular, and those medications are delivered direct to home. And in a subscription-based model. So it's interesting. I think pharmacy is where it's worked because the experiences are more transactional. I think it's tricky when you get into more clinical situations like diagnostics, but I think for transactional pharmacy experience, we're starting to see the services that are directly targeted to patients do a pretty good job at capturing not only patients that are already existing in the healthcare system, but actually activating patients that traditionally are not engaged. So that's just an example. There's a lot of ways in which consumer services exist in healthcare, but I think pharmacy is an area where this second generation business model is actually working.
How do you see that as an evolution or an outgrowth of like the mail order pharmacy or the traditional PBM business where they're already trying to reach patients, but is it just the consumer focused approach?
So I think how these companies are going after market really depends on the type of customer acquisition. So some of the models that I was just referencing, which I like to call targeted e-commerce model, they're going after specific therapeutic product sets, but more of the broad population. So PillPack, for example, is the biggest player in the mail order pharmacy space. I know we're all familiar with Amazon's acquisition of PillPack, which is a pretty brilliant move on their end. And then you're also seeing that in the specialty pharmacy space. So Alto Pharmacy, Phil, are example of that. So it really just depends on the type of customer, but in the pharmacy space across the board, you're seeing disruptors across mail order, pharmacy, specialty, and then broad population.
Okay, next poll. So we had to have an AI talk if it's market trends. So AI in healthcare is overhyped or underused. So who would say overhyped? Okay, underused. It seems about 50-50.
I still haven't found a company that can explain to me in very layman terms what AI is in healthcare.
I
like
actually was looking at a market report, and they were saying that they went to databases and they looked at companies that were grouped as AI companies. About half of them actually didn't use AI. They never made claims to use it, and there's definitely been more sophistication in how people are viewing it and trying to pressure test it and look under the hood. Yeah, do you have a
question about that?
One sec here. Can I give you
When I think of AI in healthcare, so I work with a lot of institutional dinosaurs and things of the sort, and as a consumer, I use things like 98.6. And so when I think about interacting with their like text, I don't know how many people use it, but the text bot that you interact with before the clinician comes in contact with you, that's a form of AI, and I'm trying to think of any other experience with any other healthcare provider I have or clients I serve who are actually using AI. So can you give some examples of where it's actually happening?
So I can jump in there. I'd love to hear your thoughts too. So I teach a course at the business school called Health Innovation Practicum. We have people come in from payer provider groups, and they give examples of it. I think the bot that you mentioned is great. So we had someone come in from Premera, and they said, we launched this bot. Basically, we're getting a lot of inbound calls, and 80% inbound calls are, am I covered? And so that's something that a bot can easily figure out. You can have a quick conversation, but knowing when to take the bot out is important. I think a lot of the beachhead indications for AI are things that you're not going to see as a patient, so things that are interacting or complementing the physician, which is a great segue. So like things where you've had greater penetration are in radiology, for example, where you have a large workload, you're trying to highlight things. There's always going to be the physician in the loop. And so I think there was this story originally, AI is going to eat the world, we're going to lose physicians, it's going to start taking over. And I think that there's not this mass exodus of radiologists in the world, but they're starting to have a little better workflow. They're starting to have hopefully less liability in missing things. And so it's hopefully moving to more of a complement as opposed to a supplement for traditional healthcare. And I don't know about consumer-facing applications of AI where it's really worked, but definitely we see a lot of things in image recognition, for genomic applications. So if I'm looking at, if you, heaven forbid, are looking at cancer diagnosis, you get a sample taken, that requires a pathologist to look at that and try to spot something. And there are some things that AI can be really good at in picking out, hey, have you looked over here as well when you're looking at your 80th or 50th or 100th patient for the day, making sure you don't miss something. So those aren't things that you're going to see as a patient, but they're helping support the clinician workflow.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, yeah.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
great.
So this is the CB Insights AI numbers report from Q1 2020, and it's a heat map. And what it's trying to do is it has, I guess I have a pointer here. It has industries going across as the rows and quarters going as the columns. And the first block is number of deals, and the next one is total deal value. So what you can glean from this is I've tried to highlight the healthcare column. A lot of deals, right? So there's a lot of companies getting started out with AI applications in healthcare. They're going to have certain groupings and certain applications where they can supplement a clinician or a provider and sometimes a patient. Deal value, real money there. So $2 billion total for AI. But you can see, if you look at different rows, the only one that looks bigger, you have some in media, but then transportation and logistics. There's a big company here in town where they do load leveling, sort of making sure your truck is full when it leaves. Those are sort of natural applications of it. But then the flip side comes, well, if you're putting money in, you want money to come out, right? So actual M&A for AI companies. And you can see that it's more of a mixed story, right? So there's been a lot of acquisitions in retail, a few in transportation, but healthcare is kind of buried there in the middle, right? So a lot of money has been put in, from my perspective, into healthcare companies with an AI approach. They're doing good things. They're working with the FDA, trying to figure out what the right regulatory strategy is. But there is a lot of groundwork being laid for the next generation of companies to come through, and it hasn't been a quick, clean opportunity for a lot of those groups. Yeah, so I think that to the point that you raised about sort of where would I see this, pathology, radiology, I think are sort of image interpretation is an immediate first place you would see something, and there are people already doing that. Zebra is doing that. There are FDA groups that have gone through the FDA for that. Virtual scribes, I think, is another place where you might see AI come through as a beachhead. So, you have just talk about physician burden and workload. Actually entering stuff into the EMR. The last 3 or 4 physicians I've had scribes in the room just because the burden of documentation is so high. So having a scribe take that information down to free the clinician up for other things, that doesn't necessarily have to be a college grad who's looking to go to med school in 2 years. It can potentially be someone who's listening in the background or services. Say Cara is an example of a company that's doing good work in
And
town.
Augmedic, Suki, notable companies in the space.
So healthcare is across. This is quarters, and then the darker blue it means, I forgot to put the label there, but it's the value of those acquisitions in aggregate. So if it's darker blue, it means more people are getting money out of those deals. Yep.
Are you seeing AI in pharmaceutical development and in clinical trials?
Yeah, so there's two parts to that question. The first is in development. So the short answer is yes. So you have, when you're doing drug development, you have a target. So you have a system you want to disrupt with a pharmaceutical, but oftentimes you don't have the exact chemistry or composition of matter figured out. And so there's a lot of people that, for lack of having a medicinal chemist or a protein scientist, would turn to AI to do that. So Atomwise is a company that is working to have AI for drug development to actually create new chemical entities based on, we want to find something that interacts with that. I don't know if there's an AI component to it, but there's also there's protein design software, which basically is looking for the lowest energy state of a protein fold, but then it does that numerous times in a loop. I'm not sure if it actually qualifies as AI, but it definitely takes a certain skill set to run it. And you're also looking for interaction, but it's part of this loop cycle. So the AI, the recommendations you're going to get, you have to actually figure out a way to test it and see if it works in practice, right? So I'm going to get a new small molecule, a new protein out. It doesn't mean anything unless I can actually figure out that it disrupts the system the way I want to disrupt the system when I use it in practice. And so People are working that process, kind of creating that feedback loop and say, let's test this product in actual, either in a test tube or in an animal model. But I don't know of any examples where it's gone to people yet. There's a lot of money pumped into that. I think that it makes sense that it could work, but I haven't seen that actually carried through all the way to having a drug on the market yet.
Yeah, and I think, you're referencing the clinical side. Of course, on the commercialization side, we're seeing data science companies apply AI and machine learning to better understanding what the outcomes of the drug will be like in the real world. I think, of course, what I'm referencing is a little bit more nebulous. I think you're seeing more clear applications on the clinical side, but you are seeing those buzzwords thrown around a lot with data science companies that are serving pharma.
And then one thing the agency has done, which is interesting, so they're sort of flirting with this idea of real-world data for approval. So let's say you have a product that you've gotten out for a certain indication, and you have your beachhead indication, so it could be breast cancer, prostate cancer, dementia, some sort of indication, but you want to expand to others. You have to do a clinical trial for all of those. So some of those will be used off-label. If it happens to be used off-label, could you gather that data up and look for signal? And that's another application where pharma is very, very interested. They'd like to do that without, they can't promote things that are off-label, but they can certainly gather data and try to make informed insight off of that. And so there's also a lot of companies which are trying to do that sort of look into observational data. Most of that's just really sophisticated statisticians that are working on that yet. I don't think it crosses into the AI space or sort of passive surveillance, but that would be another place that I would think there's a lot of opportunities, real world evidence, and trying to bridge that to an extension of your labeled indication. Right. Okay. So I think this might be the last poll. So big tech, we're thinking of sort of big traditional providers like Amazon's, Google's, Apple's. Big tech is the smart money when it comes to healthcare. So who agrees that big tech is the smart money when it comes to healthcare? A few, okay. Who thinks they're not the smart money when it comes to healthcare? Okay. So I think that I would caveat this. I think that I've seen a couple different iterations. I think that we're going on the second cycle of this. So I think everyone got really excited when Verily came out, sort of the Google spin out focusing on product development. We've seen a few blips on the radar, but it seems like a good way to spend a lot of money. And I haven't seen a lot of outcomes from that. And so it's an R&D shop. It's doing a lot of work. It's large, but what's the actual outcome for patient care yet? I don't know. But what I am seeing, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is sort of next generation applications. Because the first generation, from my perspective, was we did really well in software. We figured out that model. We're really smart people. We can fix healthcare. You guys haven't thought about it. We're going to roll that forward. But now they're starting to bring in industry veterans from healthcare to actually figure out what did we miss in healthcare that we need to bring on. So with Haven or Amazon Care, Andreessen Horowitz launched a bio fund, and they have some pretty sophisticated industry veterans. And so I see them actually doing outreach and bringing healthcare experts into their fund, as opposed to just assuming healthcare was a natural application for their technology. But
So I'm not just calling out Amazon because I'm from Seattle and I'm here, but I think they, out of Apple and Google and Microsoft and Amazon, although Microsoft, I think, their cloud products in healthcare. So I would say Microsoft and Amazon, they're really paving, I think, the way ahead of these other players. I think, not to oversimplify this, but what does Amazon do well? Making inefficient processes efficient and providing transparency to the consumer. That may just be lingo in digital, but they've actually put that to work. And I think the best example is PillPack, is how have they made the mail order pharmacy process, which is a very antiquated process. Mail order pharmacy has been around for 20 or 30 years. The customer service is really terrible. And they've digitized that supply chain for the consumer. And, Amazon, in the back of their heads, were saying, okay, we have a hard time penetrating consumers over 65. 5% of our Prime members are Medicare and Medicaid. So what is the best way to capture this consumer mindshare? We're going to try and digitize the pharmacy supply chain and go after the population that's over 65. So again, not to oversimplify it, but I think that their strategy, if you kind of peel back the onion here, is it's working. I think that they will continue to do more in pharmacy, whether it means making an acquisition in the retail space, I don't know. But I think what they've done to try and make a process more efficient and transparent for the consumer has been effective. I think Google and Apple are focusing arguably right now on a little bit more difficult areas like interoperability and real-world evidence and clinical R&D. But I think that Amazon picked an area where they knew what consumers needed outside of healthcare, and so pharmacy, because of how transactional it is, it was an easy way to try and apply those same business models and methods.
Yeah, the one thing I'll add to that, so Apple, the one place where I think they have done a good job is in mHealth and diagnostics. I don't know what the revenue model for that is yet. There's a really talented researcher at UW called Shwetak Patel. And he's working on applications that use native sensors on the phone to detect things, so like spirometry. So you're an asthma patient, you have to do spirometry for a set period of time. Actually figure out a system where you can just blow on the microphone. It correlates well with traditional spirometry. Did clinical trials through that, has worked with the FDA. Hemoglobin, so you put your finger over the camera and the light of the phone, it can tell how much hemoglobin you have, or jaundice checks. So those are all sort of natural applications where it makes sense for Apple. They have their traditional products, but they're embedding within that certain levels of sophistication for health. So that's things on the phone with what Shwetak Patel is working on, or within the Apple Watch, sort of testing for arrhythmia, other types of things. And the only thing I would say is that it is unexpected and laudable that they're actually working with the agency on making sure that is clinical grade and under regulation and through the right channels, as opposed to just trying to break the system and then apologizing for it later. So so I think that's one. I don't know what potential the upside of the business model for that is, but yeah. So I don't have any more. So maybe this is a good time to turn
let's
it over.
open it up to the audience. I think we have a comment here and a question.
Hey, thanks. Enjoyed the talk. I voted for big tech because of their financial depth, and they can acquire what they need as they grow. Apple's got great penetration. But my question is for Anahita, borrowing from some of the comments you made. It sounds like some of the companies who are endeavoring to sell into enterprises are a little naive to the complexity internally at healthcare giants. And so what is your appetite as an investor for, what is your insistence as an investor in terms of the management team and having healthcare expertise, on board? I work internally, and often vendors and startups are just blindly naive to the regulatory complexity and the operational complexity, like not even close often. Great idea that works in proof of concept, but implementing it is not, it's almost dead on arrival.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think, at least for us, every investor group will say management team is important, but I think some, when undergoing due diligence and evaluating a startup, that'll be, if you notice red flags around the management team, that'll be a reason to pass on a company. I think the reason being exactly what you brought up is that healthcare, I think Barnon is probably one of the most complex industries, and we found that unless there is an intimacy that the founders have with healthcare, they truly understand those complexities, it'll be really hard to build the functional business models around the technologies to actually deliver value. And so I think that it's not to say that a management team can't be mixed, where there's healthcare experience and there's for experience outside of healthcare and tech, but there needs to be some level of intimacy with healthcare, either having worked on the delivery side or having worked on the operations side. So definitely agree with you. Management team is very important, and I also think that those that have been able to lead healthcare companies through at least high growth or acquisition phases. Obviously, not every management team has that makeup, but I think that's really important because we're 10 years going on digital health, and overall M&A has, been pretty flat. Acquisitions have been, okay. I think the next decade we'll see a lot more, but I think if management team has proven that they've been able to do that, obviously, big kudos. But yeah, management team is very important.
Yeah, so two things that we look for is diversity of the team too, so like backgrounds and experience. And so if it's only, to your point, if it's only tech people, then that's a problem. Like, do they have someone who knows healthcare, has raised a company, to your point, which I think is great. But also, if you only have clinicians who are starting a company that haven't actually worked in software or figured out how to work in the cloud, they're using those terms without knowing what that actually means, and the work that has to go into it. So I think you have to have both sides of it. So it's a team sport, and so it's a problem if you only have healthcare experience and if you only have tech experience. And the next question we always ask is, who are you going to for regulatory advice? Because a lot of things you wouldn't think would be regulated are, and making sure you're aware of that, you don't step in something is pretty good.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think, chief commercial officer, whoever's on the commercialization side, incredibly important, right? Business models selling into consumers are completely different than selling into enterprise. We all know the sales cycles when you're selling into payers and providers. And so understanding that and then thinking about that when you're doing your projections and understanding what pipelines can actually look like, I think that's an indication too, is when you're looking at projections as an investor, you can tell who has a realistic sense of how long it's going to take it to sell into these enterprises. And that gives you more confidence in what what they're getting into.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I appreciate that you were talking about AI as a force multiplier and additive for care providers. And I'm wondering how you've seen the best cases when patients aren't giving predictive recommendations based on data, but you just have so much more data as a patient. And if you've seen that change the relationship between, like, for example, me as a type 1 diabetic, I'm like, I have a sensor, I have constant data, I don't need my endo anymore. Just kidding. Obviously, but I'm wondering if you've seen, especially from an investor's point of view, of like where you draw the line between really rich data and then where you draw like a danger of like this kind of needs to be put in the right hands to be scalable and fundable.
So I'll jump in that question, and I'll start with my health economist hat as opposed to my investor hat. And so there's two things there. There's the validity of the test, so is it actually predicting what you think it's going to predict, and then what do you do with that? And so if you think about like mammograms, for example, mammograms are a test. They help catch breast cancer, which is great, but they also have false positive rate. And if you have a false positive mammogram, that leads to a lot of distress, clinical decisions afterwards, which may not be best for the patient. And so I think actually fully understanding, if you're looking at any diagnostic or predictive tool, your sensitivity, specificity, and is that acceptable based on current standard is really important to tease out to make sure you understand what are the consequences of false positives, false negatives. And so I think really making sure that you dig down on that is important. And the Generation Health was a company that I worked on. I was like one of the early employees there, and we had pharmacogenomic tests we provided to people on the CVS Caremark platform. And so we had pharmacists that got a script. So someone was on Plavix, which is a blood thinner. If you have a certain polymorphism, you're going to not respond to that, so you're at risk for clots, and there's another agent you can go on. And so we were providing that free of charge to people. We had pharmacists explain it to the doctors, the clinicians, everybody. We sent them the tests, and then you saw really erratic behavior afterwards, right? And so we had, the patient we're working with, those covered by CVS Caremark would be one of maybe 500 patients that the cardiologist was working with. And so they'd remember, oh, I got a call from CVS Caremark, I should change that script. And it was oftentimes in the exact opposite direction of what you're doing. And so I think that making sure when you're inserting data into the system, it's going to get you the results you want, and measuring that with outcomes is really important. And if someone doesn't have a case for how I'm going to actually tell this is doing what I think it's going to do, adding more information isn't always the best thing. I don't know if you would.
Yeah, just quickly, and hopefully I'm answering your question, so stop me if I'm not. But where I see this kind of naive thinking around patients wanting a lot of data and then they're going to interpret it themselves, I think, is in disease management and then clinical diagnostics. If we start quickly with chronic disease management, where I see is programs like Livongo, for example, these programs need to be surrounded by coaching and monitoring. I like to call it data services, but what is that layer of either data service or tech service that is interpreting the data that's being generated from these devices, and then either interpreting that for the patient or interpreting it for the stakeholder, whether it be the payer or provider who's managing that population. And so, I don't think that we should assume that consumers or patients should be responsible for interpreting their data. That wraparound service is very important. I think on the clinical diagnostic side, I think that's why I worry a little bit around models that are trying to digitize the diagnostic supply chain. So there's some that are sending direct to home, STD testing or UTI testing or what have you. And I think what's worrisome is they may have not thought about, well, when patients are then testing at home and receiving the results, what do they do with those results? They should, hypothetically, that should trigger an event, either with the provider or with a lab who they're partnering with. You would hope that it then, if a provider is receiving that, they're not then retesting because they are concerned about the validity of the test. So again, that's just another example of when you're thinking about the delivery model and supply chain. I think it shouldn't stop. Data shouldn't be sent to the patient and shouldn't stop with the patient. You should assume that should be a triggering event for then that data being pushed somewhere for someone to interpret. Excuse me, whether it's providers or datists, as I like to call them.
Interpret and then do something with it. I think you can follow the course of 23andMe as an example in terms of just we found one study that showed a correlation with this SNP and this outcome, so we should give it to the patient and they'll figure out what to do with it. Some of those are really not great studies that they include in the start. Now they have to, there's genetic counselors involved, there's a lot higher bar of standard of evidence they're using, and so I think the clinical utility question is always there, and I think, interpreting and then doing something with it.
Question here, Riley.
Hi, can you tell us about the biotech ecosystem in Seattle and the Pacific Northwest? Maybe compare it a little bit to Boston and San Francisco, and how we can collaborate on growing the ecosystem here in the Pacific Northwest.
My favorite question. Okay. Yeah, so we have a lot of really great resources here in the area. We have UW, we have the Hutch, we have Seattle Children's. All of those are world-class institutions. People are working on solutions and cures there. And if you get enough Seattle biotech people in the same room, the thing comes up, well, why we have all these resources, why don't we have more startups to show for that? I bristle at if we just had more VC funding here, because I see a lot of companies get VC funding, they're based in Seattle, money flows across state borders. I think one thing that is always missing is the qualified executive to take an interesting discovery in the lab and figure out a commercial strategy for that, carrying it forward. And so we have a couple good examples of people who have done that well, but when you go to Boston or San Francisco, there are a ton of companies there. People have success or failure, and they go off to the next company, but then they get experience, they can go on to the next thing. And so when you see, we've had small examples here, like you have Juno. Juno was a great success story, drove a lot of talent here to the area around cell therapy. Those executives got their golden parachutes, and now they're on to their next startup. And so I think success breeds success, and we need more executives that have the ability to take those really great discoveries the scientists make and actually carry it forward to commercialization. I think that we're an undertapped market as opposed to Boston and San Francisco. I think that 80% of my job is trying to convince people from Boston and San Francisco to take a look up here, because we have some really good things going on here. I view WF as a channel partner for those VC funds, and across the board, the scientific evidence and the credibility is there for most of our technologies, but what it's missing is a qualified executive to carry it forward. So I think that if we could airdrop in 100 CEOs into Seattle who had successful exits, you would see a precipitous rise in the number of biotech success stories here, and that would be a feed-forward cycle. And I think that we're just on the start of something happening. So if you look at Juno was a great success, they're starting to build here, and they're not leaving yet right now, right? And so people move here for companies, they don't want to leave. So the quality of life here is really good. If we can recruit people up from San Francisco or Boston, a lot of times they don't want to go back, right? It's a lot nicer here. And so I think that we have a lot of the key components, and I think it's a grind, just doing the right things little by little, and we're gonna get there. But yeah, in terms of the volume or the frothiness of the market. You have a postdoc from Stanford and a pitch deck, and you can probably find someone in the Bay to give you some money. I mean, it's really pretty frothy. I think you have to have a really credible story here. The science has to be completely locked down enough to bring people up from other areas to invest in you. So if you have a specific idea or something like to talk about, I'd love to talk with you afterwards. That's one of the key focus areas for my job.
And just to add on that quickly, unrelated to biotech, but I think there's similar sentiments around digital health investing. Prior to Echo, I was based with McKesson Ventures. McKesson is a big drug distribution company. I was part of their corporate venture arm. We were based in San Francisco, and I think more and more investors outside of the Silicon Valley bubble are finding that kind of Silicon Valley in general, the unrealistic expectations around valuation, a lot of money being poured in, really without any yield. And so I think more and more they're looking at different markets outside of San Francisco, not just across, not only across biotech, but also across digital health.
Yeah, we see companies that get term sheets from the Bay and also Seattle, and I can see how the pathway to return from the Seattle term sheets, I can't actually see it from all the Bay Area term sheets. And so I think that I think we're focusing on the essentials here, which is, can this actually be a good opportunity for both the founders and the investors? And so if you make it here, you can make it anywhere, sort of thing. But I see the magical thinking a lot in the deals I see coming out of San Francisco.
We have time for one more question. Anyone who hasn't had a chance?
Thank you. This relates to the last question, and it's more about, you had mentioned investment in life sciences tools. And I just wanted to follow up with that in terms of what is the economic model or the business model for the return on investments on companies that are building life sciences tools. And given the challenges, their primary audience being life sciences researchers, where primary funding is their research grants.
Yeah, no, so I'll give two examples. So we, first is Bellwether Bios. That was a spin out from Jay Shenduri's lab at the University of Washington. And that was a way of figuring out for circulating tumor DNA coming through a patient's blood, what was a tissue of origin, or was tissue of origin for DNA coming out. And so that was something where it was a bioinformatics step after next generation sequencing. A very simple process, but they had a very clear business plan. They figured we are a really good complement for liquid biopsy. And there's a lot of money pumped into liquid biopsy companies. They have a very specific way of doing things in terms of the sequencers they use. And this tool provided a new orthogonal data set that would allow them to have greater interpretation of what they're doing. And so they applied that business model, and their goal from the very beginning was to have an acquisition. And they ended up getting acquired by Guardant Health last year, which is a publicly traded liquid biopsy company. So that was a good exit for the founders and for us, but having a clear story and expectations. And then also there, I think that when you have a drug, there's the biobucks or the upfronts and the later payments, and they're really large, right? And so you can see the clear path to an exit. With life science tools or genomics, bioinformatics, having some income come in, revenue come in sooner is better because the exits are going to be different scale. And so bootstrapping for a while, having research dollars come in, and limiting the amount of dilution you take on from investors is really important, because that you can have a really good multiple even if the acquisition is not a large scale. The other example is a company in our portfolio, Phase Genomics. They're selling kits to different labs, a lot of different applications from microbiome sequencing and also genome assembly. So they're generating revenue in the positive. They don't need to raise money, but they're raising money to scale. And so it's always the question, life science tools, you really have to be careful about thinking about what's the absolute size of the exit, and is the financing plan to build up to that going to give us any kind of multiple at all, or are we totally burning the path to a good exit from that?
Wonderful. Well, we lunched, we learned. Thank you both. This is quite a kickoff. We have a high standard to hold. Thank you, Will. Thank you, Anahita, for a fantastic conversation. Thank you to the audience for participating. Wonderful questions.